The last 15 years have been a time of easy money and a booming economy rebounding from the lows of the Great Recession of 2008. But that's all about to change. As the government seeks to rein in inflation, the tools they've utilized in the past, dropping interest rates and pumping money into the economy, have caused a sugar high in which investors have made risky gambles while money was cheap. But that's all ending now, as cheap money has led to inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. We're now several months into quantitative tightening, while at the same time the Fed is raising interest rates. We've been enjoying good times. Every investor was a genius as stocks climbed in businesses for no other reason than liquidity floating in the markets, but the party has come to an end. After the party. The Federal Reserve has a problem with inflation, which they haven't seen since the 1980s. Now, to combat that, they've recently raised rates so aggressively that some banks have been caught with their pants down, unable to provide their promised rate of return, and suffering from a public lack of confidence and a run on withdrawals. Now, this has led to high-profile closures that have revealed how intricately laced, fragile, and interwoven all our money really is. Now, you may have heard that the era of easy money is done. What that means is interest rates were held at zero or near zero for so long that banks and investors could borrow trillions of dollars, risk it in as risky of investments as they wanted to, and then they could also count on the Fed bailing them out if those investments went south. The highest Fed funds rate was 20% in 1979 and 1980, and the lowest was absolute zero in 2008 and 2020. And at 20%, even bankers count their pennies and are cautious about investing or loaning money. 0% is a raucous party where anything goes. Now, between these two extremes is waking up with the hangover of all hangovers. And that's where we're at today, with the interest rate having only climbed to 4.85%. But they've done that in less than a year after being artificially held to zero for 2 years. And we barely opened our eyes the morning after the party. And as we open our eyes, we're going to find that many of the rich have turned a quick profit on their losses by selling short and leaving the Fed holding the bill. As we open our eyes further, we'll see a riot in the streets outside called the Ukraine War, where rival gangs, Russian, American, European, Middle Eastern, and Chinese are all trying to kill each other and gain control. And when fully awake, we will find that our just-in-time delivery systems are suffering, our aging infrastructure is crumbling, and none of our credit cards work. And when we check our bank balances, we'll see that we are in one of the longest bear markets that we've ever experienced, and the wealthy have been heading for the exits with all our money well before the party ended. And there's no Uber that's going to pick us up and whisk us safely home. We have a long and dangerous walk ahead of us if we want to get home. And there's a little matter of the check before you can go home. You see, the cost of all that careless spending and reckless investing has been passed to you from the bankers through the Fed and to you, the consumer and the tax-paying worker. The check. There are several early indicators that we're heading into a deep recession that we're going to look at here. The foremost of these indicators is inflation. Unless you're rolling in money, you've probably noticed that you're paying more for everything from a bag of lettuce to a gallon of gas. Inflation hit a 40-year high on June 15th of last year, and it has continued its upward trajectory, only beginning to level off and sink a bit this year. But has it really? Unlike the inflation of the past, however, high prices are also being driven up by supply scarcity and supply chain disruption from a world war combined with price manipulation from multiple suppliers. OPEC Plus nations, they've cut production. Russian supply is shut off, and for-profit fossil fuel companies sell their product to the highest bidders overseas. All of this causes fossil fuel prices to surge. Greedflation can also occur when a company forecasts higher material or transportation costs in the future, so they raise prices preemptively now. Or they see their competitors raising prices, so they raise prices even though their production, supply, and demand, they're all stable. So even though the chart may show a leveling off or even a decline in inflation, that doesn't mean you, the consumer, are seeing any price declines. It simply means the rate of speed for these increases has slowed down a bit. You still hold a hefty check in hand. Now, unlike previous generations, we rely almost entirely on a just-in-time supply chain and delivery system. We saw what could happen to that when a container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. COVID locked us in our homes and a world war broke out. We also see the fragility of this after every natural disaster, every infrastructure failing, where the maintenance and replacement parts cannot be found. And after every substantial cyber attack shuts down or ransomware our critical systems, all of these contribute to even larger inflation increases. But they are unique to this time in history. Because they're so unique, the period of great inflation at nearly 15% during the 80s will be remembered fondly from where we are heading. The origins of the Great Inflation were policies that allowed for excessive growth in the supply of money, Federal Reserve policies. They didn't have all of these added unique compounding factors. Now, these unique compounding factors could be called a series of financial crises punctuating the contraction. If you know your history, you might recognize that explanation of national economic health decline from the longest and deepest downturn in the history of the United States in the modern industrial economy, the Great Depression. Unlike then, America is perhaps too divided for any new deal to lift us out of our depression, so get ready now. The grift. If you are the central bank, you can seemingly create money out of thin air. You can loan money at no interest, which results in investors and super wealthy investors putting billions into risky investments to turn what they hope is a quick profit. You can raise interest rates to make borrowing money harder for banks and investors. Now, between the raising or lowering of interest rates, whole banks sometimes get ground down to insolvency when they can no longer make their minimal interest payments and promise debt obligations. And we saw that with Silicon Valley Bank this year. When high-risk loans fell, the Fed purchases those loans and makes the banks stable. And that doesn't mean the banks will loan out that injected money. Now, in the past, they have turned around and bought up those same bonds created to solve those high-risk failures. Banks pay their executive millions of dollars in bonuses, even as the bank burns down around them. As if magic, all of that insolvency, debt, and financial hardship, it passes right over the executives of those banks and investment institutions back to the Fed, and eventually to you in the form of higher prices for everything in a collapsing economy. When your company can't get the money they need, it may downsize your position, slow production, or be forced to stop manufacturing altogether. And it's easy to believe that banks built this country, but they didn't. People did. It's easy to think that the Federal Reserve can solve our economy's woes, but it cannot. When the federal bank shifted its policy from a central bank that manages the currency to the primary engine of economic growth, the power went from democratic institutions to the federal government. So what does that all mean? It means that our nation's economic eggs are in a single basket. It means that the coming recession is going to be different and worse than anything that we've seen in the past. It will dramatically change a generation of Americans. The nation has relied upon the Fed to protect us over the last 2 decades, but that protection is now running out. Your new reality. The dream of a soft landing was always more of a dream than a reality. The facts are that there are too many unpredictable elements in this economy, many of those I mentioned earlier. If any natural disaster, supply chain failure, or ever-increasing war or political disaster pushes inflation higher and the job rate down, stagflation and an even deeper recession are all but inevitable. So what does that mean to you? So enough of this high-level forecast of our collectively dismal future. Let's look at precisely what this will mean for you and what you can do about it. Unemployment or stagnant wages. So far, the only good economic news is that the jobless rate has remained low, though that may be changing. And let's be honest though, even when the economy was chugging along, wages have been stagnant since 1979. These two combined are just rough for the average worker in a decent economy. In a downward economy, it's terrible news. As companies change their projections and outlook for the future, as the supply of resources slows or becomes challenged, as it becomes more difficult to maintain the high profits of the past, they will look to lay off, downsize, scale back production, and cut worker pay. So even as the cost of everything continues to rise, you have less money in your pocket to buy anything. Costs and prices rise. In this time of uncertainty, the cost of making and transporting anything continue to rise. This is translated into price, both real and perceived. And the real is the actual cost going up, and the perceived is that imaginary greedflation I just spoke about earlier. So just when you think things can get more expensive, expect them to go up in price even further for a long time to come. Social and political strife. The wealth inequalities and the government's failure to protect and insulate its citizens always result in social and political strife. politics becomes even more divisive. Some call for government assistance or bailouts, and others demand that the government not interfere while blaming the opposition or offering no clear solution themselves. And on top of that, unions push for their share of the profits for their members. They fight for higher wages and better working conditions. Crime and homelessness also increase as people are suddenly left with little to nothing of what they once had. What can you do? As dark an image as that might portray, there are always ways that you can rise above it and to endure. And there's no single great solution, but a series of little things that you can do. And there certainly isn't going to be a central bank or government that will ride in and rescue you. And let me say this before we jump into actionable steps that you can implement now. You do not have to be a victim. The decisions that you make today will define your future. So let's cover a few practical things that you can do. First, you want to get local with your supply. The more removed you are from the global supply chain that feeds the big box stores and grocery chains, the easier it will be for you when those inevitably fail. Grow some of what you eat. Source as local as possible and cook your own food. Did you know that just 10 companies control almost every large food and beverage brand worldwide? I would encourage you to not keep your faith in just these 10 companies that will keep prices down and produce food even as their profits nosedive. Don't expect the American farmer to rescue you either, as massive agro-businesses have replaced many. Securing a steady, localized, self-generated or self-prepared food source for yourself is a chief means to endure a massive economic downturn. The economic downturn we face will be further complicated by drought and flood. Even as the western U.S. receives massive amounts of rain, hydroelectric lakes and aquifers remain at low levels. And this means water insecurity will continue through this decade of financial decline. If you're in a part of the country receiving too much rain, snow, and precipitation, that can be a problem as well. Additionally, we have seen train derailments that have devastated entire communities and rendered their water toxic. Have water stored to get you through crisis and have the means to collect, treat, and filter water should those crises last longer than anyone would expect. Every massive economic downturn is accompanied by foreclosures and people being forced to move from their homes and seek other accommodations. Paying your home down more aggressively and maybe paying off any equity line of credit are good ways to build a better shelter. Now look, I'm not a financial advisor, but I don't have to be to tell you that the economic times that we're heading into will mean higher interest rates and tightening of credit. If you're barely keeping a roof over your head right now, it will get worse as the economy slides further down. I bought my first home in 2009, right after the housing market crash, and let me tell you, I drove into neighborhoods where literally every other house had a foreclosure sign in their front yard. It was pretty surreal to see, to be honest, and while I don't think we're heading into a similar situation, just don't allow yourself to risk the roof over your head. When things get tough, companies inevitably cut, and those that are in demand, they rise to the surface. I learned this principle years ago and decided to invest in myself. Back in 2005, I started my first business doing web development, and at that time, YouTube wasn't really popular and there weren't many online courses. I had to go to the library and buy books online to learn various skills. Now, obviously, the market has changed drastically since then. There are a ton of online monthly subscription services that allow you to develop a skill. My videographer, for example, who just set up the studio behind me, just a few years ago, he decided to learn video skills and he learned from several prominent YouTube channels. And now he gets gigs with Netflix and other studios simply because he chose to invest in himself. He's actually older than me and he started learning at about the age that I am right now. Now, I bring this up to point out that it's never too late to start learning a new skill, even if it's technical. Don't allow excuses to hold you back. And the final thing that you must do to survive a decade or more of economic downturn is to approach your finances as a prep. An all-out dramatic collapse is less likely than a long, drawn-out series of failures and collapses. I would encourage you to implement small strategies as we detailed in the recession-proof guide that we make available for free. So many financial lessons aren't passed from generation to generation. Let's be honest, the systems change. Still, there are some constants that you can apply today to get you better positioned to face a chaotic and declining fiscal future. We tried to outline those for you with this guide, which I'll provide a link to below. Look, I'll be honest with you. I don't see any good economic indicators in the immediate future. The Federal Reserve, they're going to have difficulty controlling a runaway economy in decline. And there are far more unknowns and influences than there really are certainties. This situation is going to get far worse before we see any light. That's just a reality. People will see what they thought was a sure future evaporate over the next several years, from jobs to homes to investments to retirement plans. Supply chains are being realigned right now in a global struggle for power and control, and infrastructure systems will continue to fail. You don't have to be a victim in that collapse if you take some solid steps forward today. A little each day may not give you a guaranteed future of everything that you want, but it may provide you with what you need. Here's the thing. The window is closing, and prepping, it's just going to get harder and harder as people struggle to make ends meet. So I would encourage you to start your preparedness today. And with every downturn, typically there is a recovery where we brush ourselves off and hopefully learn our lessons. It doesn't appear that we will see that perhaps the rest of this decade. If you do make it to that point in the rebuilding phase, it will be because you are part of a generation that reclaimed their independence, applied their know-how, and strived to free themselves from the sinking economy. As I always say, your preps, they're a life raft, and you may have them stored away for a rainy day, but I believe a lot of us are going to be using them more and more over the next few years. As always, stay safe out there.